Toby, maybe you can kick off the conversation with giving us a little bit of an overview of the unique climate and soil and land use issues that you face in the West, and then that'll be a good fodder for the rest of the conversation. So welcome, Toby. We'd love to have you kick things off.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'll start by sounding maybe a bit like a broken record here. The way in which I would characterize the West is extremely variable. We have the top 10 wettest locations in the country and the top 10 driest locations in the country. The hottest temperature on record was recorded in the West, and even the coldest temperature was recorded in the West. There's vast differences in the seasonality of how precipitation falls in the West. We have predominantly a Mediterranean climate where the rainfall is out of sync with the time of utilization. We have cool, wet winters and warm, dry summers. We have some parts of the West that are monsoonal, where the rain is falling during the time that plants are using it. And then we have other times where it's season year round. We have precipitation. Then obviously in the deserts, maybe only a couple of days of precipitation. So there's a lot of climatic diversity, as you guys alluded to. And then there's a tremendous soil diversity. In the West, we're home to all 12 soil orders. So all the soil orders that we recognize on the planet exist in the West also. And California alone has over 1,500 different soil series or soil types. So you can kind of get the picture of the diversity, the wide range of ecosystems, vast rangelands, huge productive coniferous forests, desert environments, and then some of the most productive farmland in the world. California has over 200 different crops, and it's not uncommon to produce 4 crops across a season or all seasons. So I think you can kind of begin to appreciate the complexity that's associated with making management decisions in the West. The matrix of climate, ecosystem, soils, and then cropping system makes it really challenging to diagnose soil health. It makes it really challenging to identify soil health goals, and then equally challenging to give recommendations to growers to promote practices. And so the broken record part of this all is soil health in the West is entirely place-based. And that might even in California and other locations be field-based. And so there's so much that we need to learn to give farmers the right recommendations and the right goals.
That's a great overview of the West. Thank you, Toby, for that. And Deirdre, you're working with these systems that are incredibly variable in the state of Washington. And how do your expectations and management vary for those systems?
Yeah, thank you. So as a soil scientist, I get to work across many agricultural systems, as you said, including potatoes, onions, grains, seed crops, and then perennials like wine grapes, tree fruit, raspberries, and blueberries. We have quite a lot going on here in Washington state. And I've spent the last few years traveling around the state doing soil health assessments on many of these crops and talking to the farmers about, what are their challenges that they're facing related to soil? What are their goals for the production system? And these are different in each of these systems. And as Toby said, there's hugely variable soils along with hugely variable systems. So we have some desert soils in central Washington with less than 0.5% soil organic carbon. Others, like in my area in western Washington, deal with a lot of flooding in the winter and then drought in the summer. So, but I think systems is the key word in terms of management. We need to think about in each of these systems, what are the potential interventions where we can improve soil health? And, for example, no-till has been really successful in dryland grain systems in eastern Washington, where there's a lot of rolling hills and erosion is really a big challenge. Potatoes, I work a lot in potatoes. They obviously cannot be no-till, but perhaps we can reduce disturbance in the rotational crops in those intervening years. And many farmers are doing that. They're doing strip till in the intervening years, or they're putting, multi-year cover crops in to help recover the soil after the potato crop. I also work a lot in wine grapes, which have inherently low disturbance, but cover crops can be very challenging because there's very little water. And so you can't really grow a cover crop in the alleyway, for example, because it's not going to grow with no irrigation. And so, but perhaps compost is a potential way to improve soil health in wine grape systems, as long as we, keep a close eye on things like salinity and nutrient availability, because wine grapes also have very different goals than a lot of the other crops where they're not trying to maximize yield. So in keeping the goals in mind, and keeping the challenges of each system in mind, as everyone has been saying. And I'll say that, Washington recently passed a soil health initiative through the legislature, which is really exciting. And one of the first steps for that initiative has been to develop a roadmap where we divided the state up into different regions and really got feedback from stakeholders about where they want to be, what are their challenges and where do they want to be in 5, 10, 15 years as it comes to soil health.
Great. Well, we're definitely, touching on one thing that the West is known for, which is the specialty crops. Another thing, though, certainly is the forested ecosystems. And Chuck, I want to bring you in here. I know you work with watersheds, so maybe could you talk about soil health in these forest ecosystems and how that relates to water quality?
Sure. Thanks for having me and the representative of the trees here. So for most people in this audience, this is no surprise, but most of the water in the West comes from forested watersheds. So the links between soils, water, and trees is very apparent. It's almost all of the water that comes into our forested watersheds goes through the soil profile. So there's a direct link there in terms of the sort of function that Wayne mentioned early on. When we have a disturbance like a wildfire, we have very large changes in that function. We lose the cover, we lose the ability for those soils to take up water, and we end up having very, very dramatic changes in the function of that system. So we kind of define soil health by the lack of it in those cases where we're no longer seeing water infiltrate into the soil. We're having severe surface erosion and debris flows in those first year or two following a wildfire. And we know from research in the West that those effects are long lasting to sort of restore and get back to the watershed benefits, the delivery of clean water. We require getting good revegetation, and so some of our practices to reforest or to slow down erosion are really important in those years following wildfires, so we can restore soil health.
And could you just expand on that a little bit more, Chuck? Like, what does that look like? So the wildfires we all hear about or read about in the news. What needs to be done to restore that soil after that the impact of those fires?
Yeah, that's really important to think about, and a huge challenge, and one that's not taken lightly, because the size of the fires we're dealing with now are so huge. The fire that burned outside Fort Collins, where I live, a couple of years ago was 200,000 acres, and 50,000 acres of that are at high severity, meaning that most of the vegetation and O-horizon has been removed. So it's difficult to think about places where you can really make an impact on the landscape. The practices that are typically used are things like applying mulch, some of the same things that Sally was talking about and the other speakers were talking about in terms of trying to enhance water infiltration, kind of reduce soil loss and rebuild the O-horizon. That's one of the primary ones. Other things include things like planting trees, especially things that are occurring along riparian areas where stream corridors can be stabilized, as well as nutrients can be sort of taken up by the plants, and you can sort of phytoremediate, if you'd like, these watersheds that are evulsing nutrients and sediments following fire.
Great. And I'm going to skip ahead on our questions here a little bit too to bring Toby in on this conversation of frequency and severity of fire and how that might influence soil health. And I think, Chuck, you touched on that. Toby, are there things that you want to add as well?
Yeah, sure. Climate change and decades of fire suppression are creating a new type of fire in the West, these mega fires, and they have unprecedented severity. And I think our existing research may not apply to the conditions of these mega fires. We know that a low intensity fire is probably good for soil health, releasing nutrients and such, improving site quality, managing the density of the forest in a natural way. And we also know that high intensity forests, like Chuck said, are really bad for soil health. They destroy the litter layer. They convert the nutrients from aqueous phase to a gas phase. So we lose a lot of our nutrients, especially nitrogen and carbon. And then we get accelerated erosion due to the loss of cover, the destruction of soil structure in many cases, and then the creation of water repellent layers. So we get this kind of positive feedback mechanism of negative outcomes, right? That we facilitate erosion, that degrades water quality. We get poorer site quality because of the erosion, and then it becomes much bigger struggle to restore those landscapes. And then you fold all that on top of a mega fire, where those temperatures are even more severe, lasting longer over a wider area. And it really becomes catastrophic to the point where we might lose all of the nutrients in soil, or a much wider range of nutrients in soil. And that heat can go deeper in the soil, destroying and killing the microbes, the whole profile, combusting all the soil organic matter. And finally, that heat could be so intense that it could destroy the clay minerals themselves. And those are the reactive surfaces in our soil that facilitate all the jobs that go on in soil. All the function in soil is likely and positively linked to the clay particles in those soils. So I think there's so much more to learn about the effects of catastrophic fire on soil health and watersheds and ecosystems. And it's going to be something that we just have to tackle right away.
Yeah, and it's important for soil health, and it's important for water, which is, if you had to narrow down the West issues to one, it might be water. So, Chuck, can you maybe talk about what impact does what Toby just described have on water availability and water quality?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he covered all that really well. Some of the big concerns are that in the short term, you end up with a lot of sediment moving into streams, and that influences aquatic habitat. It has a huge effect on water treatment. So our following wildfires were often limited by our inability to be able to filter that out. There's a need of additional costs for sedimentation basins, or the search for alternative sources of water. But those responses continue for years following fire. We have 20-year-long studies that show that we have 5 to 10 times more nitrogen coming out of severely burned watersheds than pre-fire conditions. So we continue to be sending nutrients down and affecting aquatic ecosystems. Basically, that's just demonstrating what the lack of vegetation is. It's, if you think about it from an agricultural perspective, it's like having a fertilized field next to a stream and no riparian buffer. Without the vegetation to take that up, you're just sending those nutrients into the stream. And so the idea of trying to think about watershed restoration from a water perspective is something that water utilities around the West are now starting to invest in and see the value of.
And Deirdre, let's bring you back in on the conversation too. On we're talking about these mega fires, but also there are gentle shifts that occur with climate change. And one of the audience questions from the people who registered was that, how do soil microbes, or how are they being influenced by climate change, and what practices can be used to manage those systems from a biological perspective?
Yeah, this is a great question, and one that many soil scientists and microbial ecologists are trying to figure out as well. There's been some great work done by Dr. Joshua Schimmel looking at impacts of drought on soil microbes. And he's found that, many microbes are adapted to wet-dry cycles. Of course, these are becoming more severe. And so that's a big question, is how are they going to respond to these more severe wet-dry cycles? But many can go dormant and then, wait out the drought. And then when moisture is available again, kind of go gangbusters. There can definitely be shifts in microbial community composition, which could be an indicator of change in these important functions that we've been talking about, like nutrient cycling and organic matter cycling. But this is really an area of active research, linking microbial community data, which is becoming easier to get, but linking that to healthy soil functions to really try and understand how these disturbances, both agricultural or human or climate change related, are impacting the microbes that are doing a lot of the work for us. And of course, as soils warm and if there's moisture available, microbial activity is going to ramp up in some systems like those that are, have been in permafrost that are warming. And so that's going to certainly impact climate change as well and have these positive feedbacks. But this is really, an area of active research. And in terms of management, the thing, it can be really complex, but the thing I always come back to is trying to feed the soil. This is kind of from an agricultural context, but really trying to encourage farmers to feed the soil, whether that's with cover crops or living roots or compost. Feeding the microbial community in the soil will help promote a lot of the benefits that we are looking for in healthy soils.
Great. Yeah, we had a podcast guest that said, "Got to feed that underground livestock," and I just love that. I love that expression, the underground livestock. But we got to wrap up here yet again. I do want to give each of you a chance to give some final thoughts or anything you wanted to include in the conversation before we do have to wrap. But we'll go ahead and go around the horn. Toby, let's start with you.
I'll just say that this is a weird time to be a soil scientist. There is just so much enthusiasm around soil right now, and that it's society-wide, and that warms my heart. But the issue is a lot of times the recommendations and the policies are way ahead of the science, and that often leads to unintended consequences and outcomes, and that breeds mistrust with science, and that makes me nervous. So I find myself being overly conservative and to some cases a naysayer as a scientist, soil scientist. I'll just give you one example of that. In our semi-arid landscapes, who would think that adding carbon through cover crops and compost can actually reduce the overall carbon stock of your soil? But we're starting to see that it does. It increases the topsoil organic matter content, but that primes the microbial activity down deep. And those microbes then consume the organic matter down deep. And if you add up all that organic matter down deep, it's more than the total. And that loss, that net loss, then has an impact, a negative outcome, right? That we wouldn't anticipate. That doesn't mean we affected soil health in a negative way, but we did affect the carbon stock negatively. So that's just one example of how these unintended outcomes can happen.
Appreciate that, Toby. And Chuck, a final comment from you.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to build on some of the things that Toby was saying before. We're in a condition right now of so many unknowns. This fire situation that we're in, it took 100 years to get to these kinds of fuel buildups that we're at now. It's going to take a long time for management to be able to address that. And that's all happening as climate is changing more and more rapidly, as we're seeing fire behavior in ecosystems in areas that we've never seen before. So the baseline is really shifting. We've got multiple disturbances. So we have fires coming in after major beetle outbreaks. These are things that we haven't had a chance to study in our lifetime, collective lifetime. And so the implications of that for post-fire recovery, what that means for the connections between soil and vegetation, and then the downstream effects, they're poorly understood and will take years and years to sort out. So it's both exciting and very daunting to be thinking about this. It's really what climate change is looking like as it's changing these landscapes that we love so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. And Deirdre, you get the last word before we bring Wayne back on here to wrap up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll continue on the soil biology vein. It's really important for us to continue to try and understand soil biological communities. And I think that also includes pathogens and plant parasitic nematodes, for example. These are big challenges. These are, some of the main soil health challenges I hear from a lot of farmers in this region. And it's something that a lot of soil scientists don't think about a lot or aren't trained to think about. So I think, as we think about soil health assessments, incorporating that kind of pathogen and plant parasitic nematode aspect into our assessments is going to be important.